Let's just get down to it.
This video on the Canadian political system will focus on the people, specifically political parties.
Okay.
And I'm going to first do an overview of political parties and then discuss briefly the party organization and then go over the party systems, which is a very important concept for the study of Canadian politics. First, an overview. Of course, political parties are organized groups that contest elections to win public office.
Okay.
They serve several political functions, they aggregate and articulate the public interest, and they structure the political dialogue. In Canada, as in most democracies, we can talk about two types of parties: brokerage based parties, which act as mediators between Canada's numerous social cleavages. And by this, we mean regional identity, class, ethnicity, religion, gender, and so on and so forth. All types of different identities that are expressed. The typical behavior for a brokerage based party is to aim for the middle to gain as many supporters as possible. These parties tend to be large, they tend to try to win elections in the sense that they actually have a shot at forming a government after an election. And because they have such a broad base, they will invariably include a really great number, a really great diversity of supporters that all have to get along in some way. So there will be a great deal of compromise to make sure.
So a brokerage party is a party with like a large value set or like a large um, group of ideas that represent the party. Is what I'm getting from this.
that everyone can feel accommodated within the scope of the party as a whole. The second type of party is the ideological or class based party. The ideological party, programmatic party, we could call it too, tends to be more rooted in ideological orthodoxy. And because of that, it tends to be smaller. It tends to be more ideological pure. It tends to stick to its ideological roots and ideals with greater loyalty, but because of that, it tends to be smaller. It tends to have a difficult time breaking out of third or fourth party status because of that.
I mean, a political party is a political party. You either agree with it or you don't. I'm not really seeing
And
the
so this is
purpose
really
of
a trade off. For a political
differentiating them.
party, should it seek to become as large as possible and then dilute its ideological heritage because of the compromise needed to attract so many voters and supporters, or should it stick to its ideological roots and then very probably, possibly, be locked out of the chance of actually forming government? The typical brokerage based parties in Canadian politics in history have been the Liberals and the Conservatives that have been the really big parties for the longest time. And the NDP has been the more ideological party, a smaller party. The Greens could be seen as this as well, as a programmatic party in that sense. And we saw after the 2011 election how the NDP became the new official opposition. And very soon afterwards, it dropped the socialist label. And this is, I would argue, a clear sign of how it's moving towards becoming a brokerage based party.
I mean, that's essentially what you got to do if you want to be a large party. Canada, you need to have a wide diversity of ideas or at least opinions on pretty much all the political topics.
Away from its ideological roots precisely because here's an opportunity, a chance for the NDP to actually contest election with a reasonable chance of forming a government the next time. It has never had a better chance of doing so, given its position as the official opposition. And if it wants to do it, it has to win the middle. And to win the middle, compromise is necessary, and then it starts behaving more like a brokerage based party to reflecting this new position. So this is the attention that any party has to take into account. Should it remain more ideologically pure? People who don't like brokerage type politics will critique it because of too much compromise. People who want to win office and think that this is the most important part tend to critique those who are more ideologically pure for not being flexible enough and not being willing to compromise enough to actually win office. So that's a continuous tension within party politics between larger parties and smaller parties. Party organizations have rules and regulations that involve the party membership. Of course, a few Canadians are actually members of political parties, but those who do are very important for the party as they volunteer time and money for it. There's also regulation about the leadership selection, which over time has grown more inclusive, and there's also regulation around policymaking. And this is really where you have these.
So these are the like when it's talking about party membership, this is the thing that anyone can essentially join. You just have to look it up, fill it out, and I think there's a small fee for joining, and you can join at like the federal or provincial level. Okay, few Canadians are members.
Tensions.
I wonder how many that is. Try Gemini this time. Nope, we want this microphone. Forever. How many Canadians are a part of a political party? Well, we'll let it look that up.
Between factions within any given political party about how it should manage its ideological history, its ideological core, and how to win office, and the tension that often arise between these two. Also, there are rules about operation, about annual conventions. They tend to have an executive, some have headquarters. Party elites tend to have a great deal of influence, even in local ridings, and then, of course, in terms of who gets nominated to run in a local riding. A final note here.
Let's see what it came up with. Well, you might see a lot of political opinions on your social media feed. The number of Canadians who actually carry a party membership card is surprisingly small. As of early 2026, it is estimated that roughly 3 to 4% of eligible Canadian voters are formal members of a federal political party. In raw numbers, this translates to approximately 1.2 million to 1.5 million people out of an electorate of about 28.5 million. So this is a relatively easy thing to do, and it gives you significantly more weight in the democracy because now you can choose party leadership essentially, just who the party puts forward, or you get a vote in it. Okay, current membership landscape. I don't know if we got to go into that. Most Canadians identify as supporters rather than members. Being a member requires an annual fee, usually around 10 to 25 bucks. Annual fee. An active registration. Most people only sign up when they want a specific say in choosing a local candidate, leadership races, policy, change. Okay. So in the end, only, what was it, 3 to 4% are members of an actual political party.
Concerns the party systems. This is a concept that scholars studying Canadian politics have discussed quite extensively. Party systems here meaning the makeup of the number of hard parties in the House of Commons, how large.
I don't think we got to go into this. In my opinion, fourth party system like these, a political party is a political party. Yeah, that's just going into like Small changes. Understanding Canadian federalism, a comprehensive guide. Let's go through this one.
This video on the Canadian political system is focused on federalism. It's this circle here is the Canadian federal state. Then federalism is how this state relates to the provincial governments, the regional governments, which it shares sovereignty with. So really, federalism then. When discussing federalism, I'm first going to just give a few general notes on what federalism means in the Canadian context, but also discuss how regions are being articulated through this federal systems. And then I'm going to end with a quick overview on federal provincial relations in Canadian political history. So first of all, federalism has to do with the division of powers between central and regional governments, with neither government being subordinate to the other. In short, shared sovereignty. And note here that municipal governments aren't included in this. Municipal governments are below provincial governments.
So this is shared sovereignty between the federal government and the provincial government. Is this like what they're talking about with provinces having more essentially leeway than a US state would have? Shared sovereignty?
In this hierarchy. There are two ways one can talk about federalism in general. One is symmetrical, which means that all provinces are treated equally, and one is asymmetrical, which means that provinces are not treated equally. And Canada's federalism, interestingly enough, is based on both to some extent. And some argue that it should be asymmetrical and that provinces should not be treated equally.
I mean, like, there are differences between provinces that require different solutions. So leaning towards symmetrically is have what most people would probably prefer. But there's always going to be certain outliers that does have to be treated differently.
And the example here has to do with mostly Quebec versus the rest of Canada. Quebec with its particular history and as a center of the Francophonie in Canada. And of course, we've seen this in terms of the expression of Quebec as a nation within Canada, Canada being then a multinational entity. But at the same time, so these two concepts have had to coexist in parallel with each other, and they do not always sit well together. An important part of this is, of course, how regions have been conceptualized. We can think about so many different ways of articulating regions in a political community. There is an economic perspective. We can talk about have and have not provinces, and this has relation to equalization payments and other economic development programs where the
So that's a big point of contention right now, because from what I understand, the Canadian system is set up in such a way that you have about the same degree of services, no matter where you are within Canada. But obviously, there are provinces that make a lot more money, like Alberta, that has oil, so it has a much higher income. So equalization is how they like spread the money out so that everywhere you can get about the same quality of service, which is obviously a hotly debated topic.
federal government, with its much greater fiscal power, has been leveraged by provinces for the purposes of province building and also to make sure that all Canadians can enjoy similar services from similar government services. Another source here of tension that has to do with the economic perspective is that natural resources are under provincial jurisdiction. And thus, that has become a source of federal and provincial conflict at times. and these differences have been
Like oil, right? It's under your provincial, but the federal government definitely wants to have a say there.
a source of interprovincial disputes as well. So the conflict here is not just provinces versus federal state, but also provinces versus other provinces. This economic perspective is, of course, tied to political economy, and we can think about a series of different perspectives to use to analyze this. One would be dependency theory, center versus periphery, how various policies by the federal state have been perceived as exploitative. That has to do with resource ownership, taxation, transportation, banking. A prime
Oh, we got a little bit of lag here.
example being the 1989
Okay, this doesn't have 1080p, so I'm just gonna leave it like
National Energy
this.
Program. This cartoon on the Canadian milch cow, where Eastern Canada is seen as leaching out the resources of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, predates 1980 by quite some while and even goes before oil was discovered. So this is a really long-standing framing of the relationship between prairies and Eastern Canada. And it tells you something about how this type of discussion and this type of conflict has been a part of Canada since Confederation. Government historically has favored primary industry over secondary and tertiary industry, and this type of industry has been in Eastern Canada. Think auto industry and so on and so forth. And there's also been uneven development and competing interests that impact claims making and policy. And then to add to that, there have been pressures from globalization and free trade on various industries. So, for instance, the free trade issue, if Canadians can go south of the border to buy cars, then what happens to the auto industry in Eastern Canada?
Yeah, in Canada, it's been kind of weird because only recently did they do a push to get rid of inter-province like restrictions. Um, before before Trump, essentially, it was actually in a lot of cases there was less restrictions just selling to the U.S. than even selling to other places in Canada. Um, which I'm happy they're moving that way. Getting rid of trade barriers usually does well.
These issues of free trade have implications for provincial economies in a quite significant extent. Also, in later years, we're talking about climate change and so on. Environmental goals, of course, disproportionately affect certain provincial economies. So, Alberta, with its fossil fuel based economy, would be significantly affected if the federal government was to institute a carbon tax, which the Liberal Party under Dion's leadership was even proposing during one electoral campaign. There is also other matters to discuss. Provinces is not the only way to identify the diverse interests in Canada. There's also geography. We have the tundra, the Canadian Shield, and so on. And just this task of creating an infrastructure across these really vast distances. Who should do it? Should it be the provinces? Should it be the crown? Should it be private companies? And so on. And to that, we can add across provinces how Canadians live, with the absolute majority living in the southern parts of the country close to the border, and the northern parts of the country, particularly the territories, being very sparsely populated. This impact
I wonder if I'm within 150 kilometers of the U.S. border. How far is Grand Cache, Alberta, from the U.S. border?
impacts political
100,
representation.
150 kilometers, 70%. I mean, like that's the warmest part of the country. So
The majority of Canadians live in Canada and Quebec. Very few Canadians live in the three
live in Canada and Quebec. I assume he means Ontario and Quebec,
territories. At the same
the
time,
most
the
populous
demographics are not stable.
provinces.
Currently, there is a shift from what has been historically important central Canada out towards the west, driven by the stronger economies and economic growth in primarily Alberta, but as well the other prairie provinces.
I mean, like, that's why I moved out to Alberta. Let's see what it says. Where's just the short answer? Okay. Straight line distance. We're a lot further up. Yeah. Okay. 540 kilometers. Most Canadians live within 150 kilometers.
With people moving from the Maritimes.
That I think a lot of that is Ontario and Quebec because like it's all essentially down there close to the US and that's where a lot of the big cities are.
To Alberta, for instance. And this also reflects back in representation in the federal government, where political parties experience varying levels of regional support, with Alberta in increasing significance in terms of economic growth and more people moving to Alberta to benefit from the jobs market there. How does that affect the electoral fortunes of the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP? When those work migrants move to Alberta, where do they settle? Do they settle in the rural areas? Do they settle in the cities? Or do they go to the industries in the north? So these dynamics really play out on several different levels. Finally, a note here: regional alienation. This concept tries to capture the detachment or disconnect from the rest of the country. This rising from the politicization, so from politicians pointing out perceived economic exploitation and political underrepresentation. This may or may not be substantive, but this here cartoon that I showed previously is really an example of how regional alienation is fueled. And the most famous example is indeed Western alienation, which has been the cause of political mobilization more than once in Canadian history. So, to what extent then do Canadians actually identify more closely with their province or their region rather than the whole of Canada? And that's a question and that question of identity has been part of Canadian politics for as long as Confederation. So, moving on to more concretely federal provincial relations, this axis is really important because, of course, provinces are the primary political platform for regional interest. That's where the institution is. That's where the body of governance exists, where someone can voice concerns over regional matters. There is no way to get representation for the Canadian Shield, but there is a way to get representation for Ontario. The Confederation settlement, then, with British North America Act, the 1867 B&A, had 5 principal components. Dividing the powers between governments, with the Canadian Federation started more as a more centralized construct than the US Federation, with provinces subordinate to the federal government, and guarantees of representation
So the opposite of what it is now.
in the Senate as compensation. At the same time, the federal government had a series of controls on the provinces: reservation, disallowance, declaratory power, which is no longer used because of how constitutional conventions have changed. And then there were the language and cultural guarantees for French Canadians. Now, the issues that have fueled the tensions between the federal government and the provinces have had to do, as I mentioned before, taxation, for instance, which has been increasingly compartmentalized, health transfer payments, despite movement to private healthcare in some places, the shared cost programs, the equalization payments, where the federal government tries to give provinces unconditional grants to ensure an equal standard of service across the country, environment, Aboriginal issues and land claims, the rise of cities, some provinces that desire involvement in foreign policy, the criminal law, which is a federal jurisdiction but implemented by provinces, and that Quebec has been recognized as a nation within Canada, but otherwise largely ignored, and particularly in constitutional matters. So these relationships then have not been without conflict, and certainly not without consequences for Canadian politics. Canadian scholars tend to talk about different models of federalism. quasi-federalism to classical federalism during the early years, emergency federalism during the world wars, cooperative federalism after the war up to 1960, which means really the federal government cooperated a lot with the provinces. Competitive federalism in the 1960s, which was an era when the provinces started using their muscles. They were building the provinces and trying to, in some ways, check the power of the federal government. Constitutional federalism, which was this whole rounds of constitutional debates and the attempts of changing the Canadian Constitution from the Constitution Act of 1982 and so on. And then collaborative federalism, which is more of a feds treating the provinces as equals and so on. And the theme across all of these years has been increased decentralization, with constitutional amendments and judicial decisions actually empowering provinces more and more, to the point where we have gone from a situation where the Canadian Federation started as more centralized than the US until now, when the Canadian Federation is one of the most decentralized federations in the world. This is a way then for Canadian scholars to classify the different types of relations between feds and provinces over the years, and thus trace the effects of the political dynamics in Canadian politics. So that was an overview of federalism in Canadian.
Okay. I want to watch these two. I don't even know if we need to watch that one. Understanding the Canadian executive branch, roles, powers, and structures.
This video.
Okay, before we get into that, I had some questions that I didn't get to ask before. What are crown corporations in Canada and how do they function? We'll start this one.
On the Canadian political system focuses on the executive, which sits here between the legislature and the administration. It answers to the legislature, so it needs to get its bill passed through the House of Commons and the legislature. And it issues instructions and regulations and so on to the administration, using the administration to carry out its policies. In Canada, the executive consists of two branches. One is the head of state, which is the Crown, the Queen, and the Governor General, and the other is head of government and the cabinet. Let's start with the Crown, the head of state, the Queen. The Queen.
Wasn't this mostly like, didn't they have, like, isn't their power mostly just signing things and they don't have any real power? I guess he's gonna go into that, right? Ceremonial duties.
Queen is the head of state of Canada. Like the United Kingdom, Canada is a constitutional monarchy. And that's because, of course, Canada inherits this system of government from the United Kingdom by virtue of having been one of its colonies. The head of state remains the same. So Canada is a constitutional monarchy with the Queen Elizabeth II as the head of state. She embodies the authority of the state. In theory, the monarch still rules in parliament, but not in practice. The monarch is really mostly a symbolic figure. And
Okay, yeah, that's a mostly symbolic figure. Something that's left over from when we broke away from Great Britain. Looks like they've never they never patched it. Okay.
Isn't even in Canada for the most part. The monarch has an appointed representative, which is the Governor General. In theory, the Governor General is appointed by the Queen on the advice of the Canadian Prime Minister. In practice, it's the Prime Minister who appoints the Governor General. The powers of the Crown, mostly symbolic, but not only symbolic. So the Crown derives powers from the Constitution Act, from letters patent, and the royal prerogative. The Governor General has ceremonial duties. The speech of the throne is one such example, when the Governor General is reading the agenda of the government, but that speech is, of course, written by the government. The Governor General also gives royal assent to legislation. Now, this was at one time an actual check on government power. The Queen, or the Queen's representative, had the power to veto laws coming from the government. Not today. Today, it's really in practice automatic, but formally, laws in Canada do not enter into effect until they have been given royal assent by the Governor General. And in general, the Crown only exercises its power on the advice of the Prime Minister. But there are some really important qualifiers to this. There are rare times when the Governor General has refused such advice. And these times have made some people describe the office of the Governor General as a constitutional fire extinguisher. So a classic example here is the King Byng thing in the mid 1920s. The situation was that Prime Minister King had a majority government. There was an election, and King now only had substantially reduced support in the House of Commons, but decided to stay in office as the Prime Minister regardless, as if there was still a majority. King's government lost the confidence of the House and went to the Governor General, Lord Byng, to ask for a new election and dissolve Parliament. At that time, Lord Byng, the Governor General, refused. It had been such a short time since the last election, and the other side had not been given a chance to form a government. Lord Byng refused the request from the Prime Minister. Now, this was 90 years ago. The question is, has by practice the office changed into a simple rubber stamp, or are there prerogative powers that can be used independently of Parliament and Prime Minister? One interesting example was Michel Jean's prorogation of Parliament. This was in the wake of the election of Prime Minister Harper's minority government. She wanted to pass a budget, but the opposition, headed by then leader of the Liberal Party, Stéphane Dion, had decided to defeat the budget together with then leader of the NDP, Jack Layton. And the two had decided to form a parliamentary alliance with the Bloc Québécois to bring down the budget. Dion and Layton wanted to form a coalition government together. They had written to the Governor General to this effect, and Harper knew that he was heading for defeat. His budget would fail. So he went to Michel Jean and asked for a prorogation of Parliament, and she granted it. The question here is, did she make this decision independent from Harper or as a rubber stamp for Harper? We don't know, because the discussions between the Governor General and the Prime Minister are confidential. We don't have access to those. The label constitutional fire extinguisher might have applied in this case because, of course, after the prorogation, the Liberal Party changed party leader to Michael Ignatieff. He decided not to honor the coalition agreement and allowed Harper's budget to pass. So that coalition actually proved to be not a very strong one. Maybe the Governor General did act as a constitutional fire extinguisher at that point, given how heated the political debate was, how animated it was, how adversarial it was at the time. These moments are quite rare in Canadian politics, but they do serve as a reminder that it's not just ceremonial duties. It might not just be a rubber stamp, and those moments shouldn't be ignored.
Like, in my opinion, the whole monarchy section has largely become symbolic. And like that's something we could probably just patch out of the government. Like, I know that there are still certain areas where like you have to swear loyalty to the crown to get certain positions, and I've seen clips of Canadians not wanting to do that because they're loyal to Canada, not the crown. And I feel like this is just it's a part of the past we could patch out. Like, everyone liked Queen Elizabeth. King Charles III seems fine. But there was also the member of the royal family that was all involved in Epstein stuff, like King Charles III. Like we got lucky there that he's the next king. Maybe we don't get lucky next time. I don't think it should be there. Like the last thing they've done was like what 90 years ago. I think our democracy could do without that part personally. Let's see what the
Prime
prime
Minister,
minister
then,
does.
this is the head of government in Canada. It derives the powers from custom and convention and exercises the powers of the crown. The Prime Minister is usually coming from the biggest party in Parliament, and powers are fused with the Parliament, not separated like in the US. This means that the government remains in office until the next election, if and only if it retains the support of Parliament on all major pieces of legislation. That's what's meant by fusion of powers. It needs to retain the confidence of the House. And major pieces of legislation, what does that mean? That's up to the Prime Minister.
So you could lose support from the PMs essentially. Check that. The House of Commons. All right. So if you lose support of the House of Commons where the PMs are, then at any time throughout your governance, a prime minister can be removed. I think we saw that Justin Trudeau getting removed and Carney being put in before calling another election.
All budget bills are confidence bills, but the Prime Minister can at any time decide that any.
So if a budget bill isn't passed, they're considered to have lost confidence then, and that triggers like an election for a new prime minister.
Bill is a
Let me just go back. Pause.
budget bills are confidence bills, but the Prime Minister can at any time decide that any bill is a confidence bill. If those bills do not pass, the government will fall. Other powers that we can associate to the Prime Minister are listed here: cabinet maker, chair cabinet meetings, party leader, chief policy maker, leading actor in the House of Commons, chief personnel manager, in sense of all those appointments that are being made, control of government organization, advisor to the Governor General, chief diplomat. In fact, so many powers have been centralized to the Prime Minister in this government over time, and this is a process that has been going on for several decades, that one author described Canada, and this was during Chrétien's majority government in the mid to late 90s, described Canada as a friendly dictatorship, which is a very evocative way to illustrate just how much power the Prime Minister in this system has. So the Prime Minister.
But the prime minister can always be removed by the House of Commons, which is what you vote and elect the PMs. I mean the members of the House of Commons.
Is not alone. There is the cabinet. It rests on a series of principles, the collective responsibility being an important one, cabinet solidarity as well. A minister who publicly disagrees with the prime minister or the rest of cabinet has to resign. Members of cabinet are selected by the prime minister, who decides who shall become ministers of various cabinet portfolios, and these are ranked by prestige too. So for the members of the party who want to do a career within government, they want to have as prestigious a portfolio as possible, where Minister of Finance is the most prestigious, and then there is a bit of a ranking there. But there is also a series of conventions that restrict the PM in choosing cabinet members. Basically, the cabinet has to reflect the demography and the people of Canada adequately. And that means that all the provinces have to be represented in cabinet. And there has to be at least some form of perception of adequate gender representation and ethnic representation and so on. Also, to complicate matters further, certain portfolios have traditionally been assigned to certain regions. So fisheries and oceans tend to be a portfolio that goes to ministers from either Atlantic Canada or BC. These cabinet ministers have to have seats in Parliament, they have to answer queries in question period, and they have to take ministerial responsibility. This last part is particularly significant. They will be the boss of departments, public agencies, their ministry, and these are fairly big organizations. And sometimes things happen further down in that organization that they really can't be expected to know anything about. Something happens, the journalist finds out about it, scandal is ensuing, and questions will be asked of the minister. But even if the minister can't realistically be expected to know anything about this particular affair, the responsibility for what happens in that public agency, in that ministry, lies with the minister. And that's what ministerial responsibility means. They rule over these organizations and also therefore have to take responsibility for them. Finally, there are 4 agencies that support the Prime Minister and Cabinet. There are
Okay.
3 non-partisan such: the Privy Council Office, the PCO, that organizes and supports decision-making systems. And there is the Department of Finance and the Treasury Board Secretariat. And then there's the partisan one, the Prime Minister's Office. This is the place where the Prime Minister's politically loyal staff and political advisors assist the PM in various political and logistical matters.
So like the people that were like campaigning with him or for him.
It gained a lot of attention during the Duffy scandal, where questions were asked by journalists how independent senators were from the government and from the prime minister. Specifically, there was talk about how maybe there were people from the PMO coming down and meddling with how conservative senators were conducting their affairs in the Senate. And this is the office that they were talking about then. So that's the people that the prime minister can send out to conduct his business.
Okay. We got one more here. House of Commons. That
On the Westminster.
start at the beginning. I asked the question, didn't I? What are crown corporations in Canada and how do they function? Think of a crown corporation as a hybrid between a government department and a private business. They are essentially companies owned by the crown, the state, but designed to operate with the freedom of a commercial enterprise. In Canada, we use them to provide essential services that are either too expensive or private companies to handle or too important to national interest to leave to the free market alone. Okay. How they function. Unlike a government department, which is run directly by a minister, a Crown Corporation operates at arm's length. The board of directors, mandate, okay. Federal versus. Okay, here we go. Levels. Federal. Notable examples: Canadian Post. What they do: national mail delivery. So the Canadian Post partly function like a government department. CBC / Radio Canada, Via Rail, Bank of Canada, ATB Financial, Travel Alberta. Why do we have them? There are 3 main reasons Canada leans on this model. Market failure. Private companies might not want to build a railway to a tiny town or deliver mail to a remote cabin because there's no profit in it. Crown Corporation does it because it's a public service. National identity and sovereignty. The CBC was created partly to ensure Canadians had Canadian content, preventing our culture from being entirely absorbed by American media. Okay. It's good to have your own news network. Revenue generation. Some provinces use crown corporations, like liquor boards or utilities, to generate profits. Okay, well, that all sounds good. Efficiency versus service. The big debate usually centers on privatization. Critics often argue that crown corporations are bloated or inefficient because they don't have the same pressures to innovate as private competitors. Proponents argue that if you privatize them, prices will skyrocket in services. Service to rural areas like the North or rural Alberta would disappear. I mean, that's a hard thing to balance. Hmm. Like, I believe you should have crown corporations, but like they must be allowed to fail. The issue is when you have something like this that has this ties to the governments and you prevent it from failure, that you run into a lot of troubles. Like Canada Post, we have it, it exists, but we like there's also other delivery services, private delivery services that also function. So allowing it to exist and not choke out other businesses, like I think that's the proper way to do it. Okay, last one.
This video on the Canadian political system focuses on the legislature, which sits between the people and the executive. In this being a parliamentary democracy, the task of the legislature is to represent the people and hold the executive accountable. Now, this is, as I mentioned, a parliamentary system. It is also a
So the House of Commons is where you vote and your MPs go to represent you. I'm still not too clear on what the Senate even is.
Westminster Parliament. It's based on the Westminster model of parliamentarism, which means the fusion of powers. It means legislative sovereignty, which can also be called parliamentary supremacy. In short, Parliament is really it's the seat of the supreme expression, really, of the democratic will of the Canadian people. Now, it's a Westminster Parliament. It's also bicameral, just the Parliament in the United Kingdom. It has a House of Commons and a Senate. The Senate being modelled on the House of Lords of the United Kingdom. And the power relationship between the two is very similar. I'm going to start with the House of Commons because that's where the real action is, and then I'll close this with a few words on the Senate. So the House of Commons, then, the main chamber of democracy in Canada, the place where all the important decisions are being made, the confidence of which the government has to retain to remain in office. That's what meant by fusion of powers. The government of Canada can only remain in office as long as it has the confidence of the House of Commons. The main functions here. So this is the main body. It's elected. It currently has 308 seats. Now, the number of seats is variable depending on population size in Canada. It's not likely to retain only 308 seats indefinitely. These seats are limited term, maximum 5 years, depending on how long the Prime Minister wants to wait with a new election. So all the members of Parliament have to seek re-election, and the House of Commons must meet at least once a year, usually 2 sessions in a year. The major events in a session are the speech from the throne, which is done by the Governor General as
Wait, so this body only meets once or twice a year? What do they do the rest of the time?
the symbolic representative of the Queen. There's the budget, the estimates, and opposition days. The House of Commons has 3 functions, really. It's passing legislation, it's representing Canadians, where each province is represented in proportion to its population, and the scrutiny of the executive branch. The question period here is really a best example of that. It's the most famous daily occurrence during a session of Parliament, and it's the time where the opposition gets to ask pointed questions to members of cabinet, either the prime minister or other ministers. Now, it's important to remember that question period is there really for the benefit of the Canadian people. Even though in a majority government, the opposition doesn't really have the number of seats necessary to stop legislation, it's at times like the question period that the opposition can ask the critical questions from the government and use that to show to voters that there is an alternative. So that's really how the House of Commons can hold the government accountable.
Okay, let me see. This is the House of Commons. If the House of Commons only meets twice a year, can they only pass legislation twice a year? Like, do they just compress everything into like a small meeting? A lot busier than that. Okay, that's good. Here, the country would likely grind to a halt. That's the problem I was seeing. The confusion might come from the way a session of Parliament is described, but in reality, members of Parliament, MPs, are in the House for a significant portion of the year. Okay. Instead of meeting twice a year, follow the sitting calendar that usually totals about 135 days per year. These sittings are grouped into blocks. During these months, MPs are typically in Ottawa for 3 weeks of sitting, debating, and voting, followed by a Constitution Week, where they head back home to their ridings to meet with voters. They can only pass legislation when sitting. Yes, for a bill to move through the stages of becoming a law, the House must be sitting. Bill has to go through specific obstacle course before it becomes law. If the House is on summer break or winter break, the clock stops on that legislation. Oh, stages include the first reading, the bill is introduced, no debate. Second reading, the big picture debate on the principle of the bill. Committee stage, a small group of MPs study the bill line by line and invite experts to testify. Report stage, the House considers any changes made by the committee. Third reading, the final debate and vote in the House. The Senate, the whole process repeats in the Senate. Royal assent, the Governor General signs it, and it officially becomes law. Okay, that's a good amount of debate. Invite experts to testify, always a good idea. Twice a year myth. You might be thinking of the throne speech. A session of Parliament usually begins with a speech from the throne, while a Parliament, the 4-year term, can be broken into multiple sessions. There is no rule saying they only happen twice a year. Some sessions last for months, while others can last for 2 years. Okay, that clears it
might
up
not be
for
able
me.
to stop legislation, but it can ask critical questions and it can show voters that there is an alternative. And that's what question period is really all about. It's to show voters that hard questions are being asked and there is another alternative than the government has. So that come election day, voters can use events like the question period to inform their decision as they're standing by the ballot box. The House of Commons has to run, of course, administratively and logistically. So there is an organization, and there are officers, the Speaker, and numerous officials assist in this running of the House of Commons and the day-to-day affairs. The voting and speaking procedures are really carefully regulated and controlled, and the political parties must select a House leader and a party whip who manage party business and discipline. There are also agencies under the House of Parliament that serve or criticize Parliament. So there's the Auditor General, for instance, there's the Chief Electoral Officer. These are not under the cabinet, they are agencies under Parliament. And the Auditor General, for instance, has as a task to audit the expenses and activities of the government. So this is really another check on government power, the reports coming out of the Auditor General. Committees is where the real legislative action takes place. As I mentioned, question period is important to show Canadians that there are alternatives.
So that twice a year thing is more of a question period uh, put on to show Canadians. You have your speech, kind of like I assume like the State of the Union, but with like a question follow up from other members of Parliament. Okay.
But everybody in Parliament pretty much knows what's going to happen in question period. The government will say certain things, and the opposition will say certain things, and these will largely be along party lines, which everybody who is in Parliament is pretty much familiar with already. So I think there is a fair argument to say that the MPs themselves are not expecting any surprises to come out from question period. This is the role of the opposition is to be adversarial to the government, and the government's role is to defend its politics. So that's pretty much the dynamics that's going to happen during question period, and everybody can expect it. In committee, however, the real legislative agenda takes place. It's often behind closed doors, which means that it can be considerably less adversarial. And here, substantive parts of legislation can be discussed without the usual theatrics of the floor of the House of Commons, which means that sometimes it's possible that there will be a compromise and discussion and so on and so forth. A good deal of the practical work of creating legislation, particularly of the pieces of legislation that are not particularly politicized or particularly inflamed in the public debate, will be hammered out substantively in the committees. There are two types of committees: standing committees that are relatively permanent, covering specific policy areas, and special committees that are sometimes only temporary. For MPs, the act of being
So committees, standing committees. I feel like they didn't go into that too much. Because committees are not elected. Are they just like groups designed to assist the members of parliament in specific areas? In Canada, what are the roles of committees and how it affects the House of Commons? Well, let's just see what that gets me.
a member of parliament contains several different tensions, really. First of all, when it comes to voting, should the member of parliament be a trustee or a delegate? The trustee is the person who votes according to their conscience or the view of their constituencies, and the first past the post method, the electoral system, is based on the idea that the constituency as a whole elects a person to represent them in parliament and represent the views of the constituencies in parliament. The problem
No, he might go into this.
is,
Let me just
however,
keep
that
playing
this
it.
is a parliamentary system. So, to retain confidence in the House, delegates have to vote according to their party lines, according to how the
Like this gets into the whole members of parliament crossing the aisle and joining a different party. Like, do you vote based off the will of the people, or are you voting based off the party that you told the people that you were a part of? Because a lot of people, like, they don't deep dive their specific MPs and figure out what their MP is. They look at who that MP, like what party they're a part of, and that therefore who they support, and therefore they look at the leader of that party and choose the vote based off what the leader of the party is saying. So did they vote based on the party line, or did they vote based off the views of their people or their views. That's where things can get messy.
The party wants them to. They have to stay to toe the party line. These two ideas of what an MP should do are very potentially conflictual. But since this is a parliamentary system,
They can be mutually exclusive at times. Like you can't. There are times when you can't do both. And so, what are they supposed to do?
incentive to act as a delegate is very strong indeed, because otherwise there would be government crises and instability within the system, and we'd have a few elections on our hands. An MP has a lot of priorities. They can be seen and see themselves as lawmakers, propagandists for a particular political cause, or constituency representatives. And these are also potentially contradictory, not necessarily harmonic with each other. A propagandist can hold ideas that are at odds with those that the constituency might have. And then the MP would have to show the constituency why these ideas are good. On the other hand, someone who sees themselves as primarily a constituency representative might have to compromise their own ideological beliefs. They also have lots of obligations. They have to divide their time between constituency, legislation, policy, and then party work, and therefore have staff to assist them with the workload. The party really is key in Parliament and certainly Canadian democracy because it is a parliamentarian system. The leader of the majority party becomes the Prime Minister.
Okay, let's see what it said. Right, Dex. I want to ask that later too. Okay. The House of Commons is the stage where the drama of politics plays out. Committees are the engine room. They are where the actual heavy lifting of government happens, away from the TV cameras of question period and the shouting matches of the main chamber. Here is how the government and the massive impact they have on Canadian law. The rules of the game. Committees are governed by a set of rules called the staging orders. Because a group of 338 MPs is too large to read every line of a 200-page bill, the House delegates that work to these smaller groups, usually around 12 MPs. So, committees are made up of MPs and they're assigned to do tasks essentially. Membership. The membership of seats each party gets on a committee is proportional to how many seats they have in the House. If we have a minority government, the opposition can actually outvote the government in a committee. The chair. Most committees are chaired by a member of the governing party, but certain watchdog committees, like the Public Accounts Committee, are always chaired by an opposition MP to ensure the government is being watched. Powers. This is where it gets serious. Committees have the legal power to send for persons, papers, and records. This means they can subpoena CEOs, experts, or even ministers to testify under oath. Oh, I'm going to be interested when we get to the US section. Because I think we're seeing this in the US, something similar. Quorum? Usually 1/3 of the members must be present for a meeting to officially start. Only 1/3 of them have to show up. In 2026, many committees operated in a hybrid format, allowing MPs to participate remotely from their ridings as long as they are within Canada. I mean, like work from home is going to be a thing that grows in the future, I think. So allowing that to get it to get the membership rate, the arrival rate above 1/3 would be nice. How committees affect the House. A committee doesn't have the power to pass the law on its own, but it can make it or break it before it goes back to the House for a final vote. The bill surgery. Amending legislation. When a bill is sent to a committee, They go through it clause by clause. Impact. They can debate entire sections, add new rules, or fix errors. If a committee makes significant changes, the version of the bill that goes back to the House for the third reading might look very different from what the Prime Minister originally proposed. Holding the purse strings, committee review the estimates, the government detailed spending plan. Committees are the only place where regular Canadians and experts get to speak directly to the legislative process because they can call people and experts, right? Oh, there's a bunch of different types. Standing, permanent groups, health, finance, defense, lasts the whole session. Special, created from a one-off issue. Legislative, created specifically to study one single bill. Joint, includes both MPs and senators. The sobering second thought connection. While the House of Commons committees are partisan and often fiery, Senate committees are often cited as being more expert driven. Because senators don't have to worry about being reelected, they often find technical flaws in bills that House committees missed. So committees are made up of members of Parliament from the House of Commons, designed to essentially do tasks like look over the health, finance, and defense, or specific bills. All right.
The head of the biggest opposition party becomes the shadow cabinet. Then there are backbenchers, and almost all activities are organized.
Head of the second biggest party is the shadow cabinet. What's that?
Shadow cabinet. Then there are backbenchers, and almost all activities are organized along party lines. Each party's elected members, they meet in a party caucus, so that's the party group within Parliament, and these are secret meetings to allow the members to voice their minds and collaborate together in a more effective manner. Party discipline is usually very high. Again, this relates to the non-confidence system, and those who want to advance in the party will pay particular attention to party discipline. Backbenchers is physical. It's a
Wait, I don't know if I fixed stuff on my stream. We've been under Overwatch. All right, I got to adjust that.
term that has to do with their physical position in the room. The people in the back of the rows of benches are those who are lower in the party hierarchy. The people who sit at the front bench are the party leadership. People politicians who want to advance within the party and thus move forwards in the seating arrangement in the floor of the House of Commons will have to pay particular attention to party discipline. I've mentioned the non-confidence system and the adversarial situation in Parliament, and of course this has to do with government-opposition balance. This is an adversarial relationship. The government wants to be able to pass legislation, the opposition wants to scrutinize and criticize the government and its legislation, and even bring down the government. This dilemma is weaker in a majority government because, of course, the government can get its legislation and its agenda passed. In this situation, in the majority government,
No, that's kick. Changed it. Which also changed it. All right, get back to it.
Parliament is almost completely controlled by the Prime Minister or the Cabinet, and opposition are holding them accountable through criticism and delay, really, and that's what I talked about previously about question period. In a minority government, the government is outnumbered by the opposition and then really have to pay attention to what the opposition says and rely on these parties for support. When it comes to legislation, there are two major forms. There's public or government bills, and that's the majority of all legislation introduced. And then there are private members' bills, and those can involve a specific person and so on. A single member of parliament, be it a government backbencher who is not a member of cabinet, or anyone from the opposition. That would be private members' bills. These private members' bills cannot include something that will, a budgetary post. So something that will mean spending tax money. That doing so is the prerogative of the government. And all bills have to go through the multi-stage legislative process before being passed. Finally, a few words on the Senate. It is designed
Okay,
to
here we go.
exercise sober second thought on the House of Commons. It certainly doesn't have the amount of power that the American Senate does. In that sense, it's much more like the UK House of Lords. So the Senate can delay and amend bills from the House of Commons, but it doesn't have the veto power of the American Senate. It's also supposed to provide representation to Canada's various regions and provinces, but how much can the Senate really achieve these objectives? That's up for debate. The members here are appointed, not elected, and very often seen as being partisan loyalists. And a great example of that is the lengthy discussion on the role of the Canadian Senate during the Duffy scandal. And how much are the senators really just party loyalists, or how much are they independent of government, and so on. So this issue of Senate reform and the need for Senate reform has been discussed for decades in Canada, because there are so many people who feel frustrated with the function of the Senate. This idea that senators are appointed, not elected, can be rather jarring in a contemporary democracy, but also the issue of whether the Senate actually has any real power to begin with, and to what degree it does represent the various regions and provinces. So all these three matters have been reason to discuss Senate reform. The alternatives that have been presented is everything from abolition to minor tweaks. A very prominent proposal has been the Triple E Senate, where members would be elected, have effective powers, and provide equal provincial representation. So that's the three E's: elected, effective, and equal. But two things have made reform really difficult. First of all, to change the Senate would require constitutional amendment, and that in Canada is very difficult to achieve. Second, there is no real consensus on what to replace the status quo with. And because these two things together, the status quo prevails.
So basically, it's a system that doesn't work, but it's hard to change. So they've just taken away a lot of its power. Okay. I mean, like, what does it provide that the House of Commons doesn't already provide? I mean, I guess that's why abolishing it is one of the things they were talking about. Hmm. All right. Well, that's